thank you for inviting me. Thanks to Debbie, Carolyn, and Tim for this opportunity. I'm very excited about this. I am not a fire professional. I am not a firefighter. I don't come from a firefighting family, but I'm very interested in fire history. And part of the reason is I think it's something that everyone should be interested in, that it's part of our collective history. So I'm very grateful about the opportunity to talk about my research here. As Tim said, I'm the author of 9 books or so on Boston history, about fires, crime, drinking, the mob, sex, you know, the good stuff of Boston. I haven't hit Tom Brady yet, but there's still time on that. So I want to talk about the Great Boston Fire of 1872. As Tim said, not a lot of people know about that, even in Boston, but it was one of the worst fires in Boston history. And it was one of the most expensive fires per acre in American history. It wasn't the biggest fire, but it was a very expensive fire. And it has a lot of lessons for us to know that are resonant for today. And there's a lot more we can know about it. Even though it happened more than 150 years ago, there's a lot we can learn about it. And the way I'd like to approach this fire is by looking at the fire and life safety ecosystem of the National Fire Protection Association. It's a way of looking at fires and fire safety with several areas that interlock, that have an overall effect. And I think that's a very valuable way for us to look at this fire and to look at other dangerous systems of today, because it isn't necessarily one thing as it's a problem, it's a series or an ecosystem of things. So let me just answer a question. People always ask, well, why'd you want to write about this fire? And I'll be quite blunt. I was fascinated by its scale. What I'm showing here are panoramic views of Boston in the days after the fire. And as you can see, it looks like a nuclear bomb went off. It was a devastating fire that stretched block after block from the center of downtown Boston right to the harbor. In fact, if it wasn't for the harbor, it might have kept on burning. So the sheer scale of it was very interesting, particularly because there are almost no traces of it today. It's all been rebuilt. So a lot of people aren't aware of it. But let's talk about this fire. I'm going to zero in on just a little bit of context. So in 1872, Boston had about 250,000 people. It was a very busy port city. A lot of industry was going on, a lot of sailing, a lot of ships going in and out of the harbor with goods and goods coming in, goods coming out. It was the intellectual capital of the country. The people of Boston like to consider themselves the Athens of America. A little bit big, a little bit prideful, but that was the way they thought about it. The downtown area of Boston, which was what today we call downtown Crossing, was an area that used to be a residential area, but in 1872 it became a commercial area. So there were new buildings there were warehouses, there were factories, there were retail operations, and these buildings weren't just any old buildings. They were homages to the powers of capital. They were built with granite and a lot of architectural embellishments, such as mansard roofs. They were made of brick and iron, but also granite was used. And they were soared to in what were considered impossible heights before, of 5 and 6 stories, which were very different from what had been there before. In 1872, Boston's fire department was considered to be one of the best in the country. It was very well regarded. And you'll notice up in the corner, I put a little icon there, and you'll see these icons throughout this presentation that reference some of the NFPA ecosystem. But here's the thing about Boston. There were numerous infrastructure flaws in their safety system. For example, the big one was in that downtown area, the water mains, which brought water for firefighting purposes, because that was the main weapon used, were rusting, or they were too small. They were put in for a residential area, but now you had buildings 6 stories high, so they weren't able to keep up. There was also a lack of fire stations in this vulnerable area. Was valuable property. No one wanted to put a fire station there. And those mansard roofs, which a lot of these buildings had, were made out of wood. And while they were very popular, they're also very dangerous because, as a fire chief said later, they were like elevated lumber yards. And there was also some problems with the hydrants. They needed to upgrade the hydrants from something called the Boston hydrant to a Lowry hydrant, which would make the water pumping system more efficient. And the reason we know that there were all these problems is because of this gentleman here. This is John S. Damerel. He was the fire chief of the Boston Fire Department. They called him engineers and those, a chief engineer. But he was a firefighter's firefighter. He was a volunteer firefighter from a very young age. He worked in a number of fire departments there. He was elected fire chief. That was an elected position. And he was himself a builder. He was a carpenter. So he knew how to build buildings safely. And he was very concerned that the buildings of Boston were not being built safely. And so he made it his life mission to alert the city to what he considered were the problems. And guess what happened? He was mostly ignored. Even in his annual reports, he hammered at the thing. We need better water systems. We need more fire stations. We need a better safety infrastructure. And he was told, hey, it's too much money. We can't do it. And don't try to magnify the wants of your department or your office so much. In other words, he was told he was there to do what the city council told him to do, not to make independent suggestions, even though he was in position to know the most about it. Now, another aspect of this that was very important is that the public was very proud of the fire department. Boston just was extremely proud of what their firefighters could do, but that kind of lulled them into a false sense of security. And they even sneered at this idea that, well, you needed more fire stations. I mean, one editorial writer said, well, what does it matter who gets there first? Well, it'll all be put out eventually. So even though the public was very proud of its department, it was not informed of what was needed to keep their city safe. Now, here's a point I want to stress. Boston was not unique in any way. Many, many cities at this time in the United States were facing major urban fires. Baltimore, New York, others. In fact, urban fires were a major threat to the general cities all around. This is because cities were growing up very fast. They were packed. They had many of the same problems of Boston in terms of not the infrastructure, not keeping up with the building. So it was a major fire problem all across the United States. The one that I think you know about is this one. And that was the 1871 Chicago fire. And everybody knows about this fire and Mrs. O'Leary's cow and all that. And indeed, that was probably one of the most devastating fires in American history. It covered more than 2,000 acres, 17,000 buildings, 100,000 people were displaced, and nearly 300 people died, about $200 million worth of damage. So absolutely devastated. And when that broke out in October, firefighters all over the country paid attention, including John Damerel, pictured here. Damerel went to Chicago after this fire to see firsthand the damage and also to bring some money that his fire department had raised for the Chicago fires. He went there, and what he saw chilled him. He came back and he said to the city council and other people, what happened in Chicago could happen in Boston. We have some of the same issues, and you need to pay attention to what I'm saying. And again, he was shuffled to the back, kind of ignored. And the one thing they did do is they did say, okay, we'll build you a fireboat. And it was built, but it went into commission right after the Great Boston Fire. So even with this warning from the Chicago, Boston did not pay heed, because it couldn't happen in the Athens of America, could it? It could happen in Chicago, but not here. It couldn't happen here. We hear that all the time, don't we? Here's another little interesting thing about this fire, which is a sidelight, but is very, very important, because a lot of people don't know about this either. But at the time, there was a pandemic going on for horses, an epizootic, they call it, the great horse epizootic. And what happened, it was a flu that spread horse to horse very rapidly. Horses got extremely sick. They were too sick to work. They didn't necessarily die of it. Some did, but were too sick to work, and it spread quickly, almost mysteriously. And I think, having been through our own pandemic, we can recognize this was a virus, or some kind of flu virus. But at this time, there was no germ theory. They didn't even know what a virus was. So this plague was very mysterious, and people didn't know how it spread. So they really couldn't take precautions against it. And the plague of the horses spread all across the country, following the railroads. Why railroads? Because horses were being transported by rail cars. And a horse would seem okay, load him up on the rail, he's fine. But a few days later, he got sick, or she got sick, and infected other horses. And again, we've seen this with our own experience with the pandemic. But what happened, this was like an entire electrical grid blackout in the cities affected. Because horses, it was horsepower. Horses pulled everything. They pulled wagons, pulled trolleys. The only thing they didn't pull were the railroad cars. So you see all around the country, manpower or human power was substituted for horsepower. And some of the horses indeed got very sick, and it was devastating for people who used them for their businesses. And then there was also, interesting, an outcrying of support for the horses. I mean, this is the beginning of the anti-cruelty to animals movement, and many people said, we got to think about treating our horses better. Now, all this really impacted the Boston Fire Department, because guess what? At this point in time, horses drew the fire engines that were very important to go to fires. And these were very, very specially trained horses. So with the horses were sick all over Boston. And even if they tried to get healthy ones, these horses were extremely well trained, and they were well loved by the fire departments. But they would hear the bells, they would line up, the halters would come down, they go to fire. They're trained not to run with sparks and fires and smoke. And so it was difficult to get substitutes for this. And so Damrell was very concerned that they wouldn't be able to respond in a timely way to fires. So what he did is he convened all his department, and they got together, they came up with a plan to cover the city. They got ropes and other things, and men would pull the fire engines. Men used to pull fire engines back in the day before they got steam engines, and they were much heavier and they had to use horsepower. So he set up a system where the manpower would take the place of horsepower, and the city would be covered. But this meant that fewer engines would respond to an alarm. And there's a system of alarms, and alarms in the downtown area usually brought in more people. Well, he wanted to reduce that to make sure that everybody was covered. So the system seemed to work until it didn't. So I'm often asked what caused this fire, but that's not the real question to ask here, and it's not the question to ask in a lot of different cases. What we had in the Great Boston Fire was a total systems failure. Fires at this point of time happened all the time. Fires were always breaking out, but they didn't spread across the city, and they didn't become this inferno or this conflagration that almost took out the entire city. And the reason for that is because there were so many other factors that were involved. And we've gone over some of them, and now we're going to drill down into that. So keep that in mind. I'm going to jump ahead. They don't really know what caused the fire. I mean, they have a good idea what happened, but they don't really know it. But like I said, fires like this happen all the time. They didn't always spread like this. So again, we're going to apply the ecosystem to understand this. So we're talking about the night of Saturday, November 9th, 1872. And fire was seen in the lower floors of this building. It's in Kingston and Summer Streets, right in the middle of the city. 7 o'clock, it was already dark. Most of this area, because it was retail, was deserted. There weren't a lot of people there. But somebody saw a fire there. And they think that maybe a furnace, there was a basement furnace, that a spark might have escaped and ignited some flammable or combustible material there. And then it spread. But the fire kind of took over this building very quickly. It kind of shot up, they think, the chimney, and it went right up to the top with a mansard roof. And so it was involved very quickly. But there were a couple problems with getting the word out on this fire, and that involves preparedness and emergency response. Now, Boston this time had a series of boxes, fire boxes. I mean, you've seen them, you know what they are. They're all over the country. And Boston had actually innovated the system as a fire telegraph system. So it wasn't electricity. It was part of the telegraph. If you want to say use that type, it was a telegraph system. And they had these all over the city. And when there was a fire, they would be opened up and they'd be cranked, and that would send a signal to the fire alarm headquarters, which would alert the fire station closest and would ring fire bells. So that if a box 52, for example, was pulled, the church bells would ring 5 strikes and then 2 strikes, 5 strikes and 2 strikes. And people knew, and the firefighters knew where they was, and they could get right to the fire. One problem with the system, it was a very good system. Because they were afraid of false alarms, these boxes were kept locked. There was always someone nearby with a key, some responsible citizen, and all the policemen in the area had keys. But what happened this night was that people saw a fire, but it took a while for them to get to a police or get to someone who could unlock the box and sound the alarm and crank it and sound the alarm. So the fire was probably seen a little about 7, but the first alarm didn't go out till 7:24, which brought in a certain number of people. Second alarm draws in more people. Third alarm, fourth alarm went out at 7:45. And that called every fire engine in the building to the site. Now, Damrell, fire chief, heard the bells. The Saturday night, he was at home. He heard the bells ring and he ran. He lived on Beacon Hill. He ran to this fire. He literally got his helmet, his axe, and ran there. This is a map of kind of the spread of the fire. You can see in this this area down here, that's where the fire started, and then it quickly sped. It was out of control very, very quickly, even though 3 fire engines got there fairly quickly. And remember, they were pulled by people. They were not pulled by, they were pulled there. And then the minute Damrell saw this fire and he saw how it's spreading, he sent word to call every single fire personnel in the entire area. So little by little, more people came in. Many of them pulled their fire engines for miles and miles to get there because the horses sickness, but the fire spread, and you can kind of see it goes right out to the wharfs to start burning the wharf, and it continued for a day or so. This is a picture of, you can see where the fire started. This is obviously after the fire, was probably approximately right there. And what we have was scenes of devastation. A couple things I'll draw your attention to. One, all the people in the street. Fires were great entertainment in those days, so a lot of people flocked to see what was going on. A lot of merchants, seeing the fire spreading, tried to get out their merchandise. They could see it coming toward them. They were trying to get things out. And when they couldn't get things out, they started giving stuff away. So it was very hard to tell who was looting, and there were looters, and who was just taking advantage of free stuff. But a couple things you'll notice from these illustrations. By the way, there are no photographs of the actual fire. The photography was not advanced enough. So we have pictures after the fire, but not during the fire. But notice how the streams of water are failing to reach the top of the building. This is the thing that Damrell had worried about, that there wasn't enough pressure from those mains to get enough water into those fire engines to get them on top of the building, because it's better to fight the fire from the top down. Okay. And in many cases, the firefighters would be getting control and they'd run out of water, and they'd have to move. So it was a struggle to get enough water to control this fire. They had to deal with people in the streets, the water, deploying their people, and it seemed to inevitably spread and spread. It's interesting that the reporters were on the scene immediately and were watching a lot of this, and they coined an expression that I think really explains this fire, and they called it the fire fiend, because this particular fire was so hot that it almost created its own kind of persona. It was a hurricane of fire. It created its own wind. And so as it moved through the city, it almost seemed like a monster because it was so hot. And why was it so hot? Because the buildings in this area were filled with material. They were warehouses. It was in November. They were all filled with material for the holiday season. Lots of combustibles. Another thing, those granite buildings, they were very fine, but granite is porous. So when it heats up, it can explode. And so firefighters were dodging bits of flaming granite that was exploding for buildings. Those mansard roofs, that was the other problem. Those wooden roofs, fire was spreading roof to roof to roof, making it almost impossible to get streams of water on it and burning out of control. And so those very popular mansard roofs turned out to be a real hazard, just as Mansard and just as Damrell and other people had predicted. This shows you exactly the problem here. You can see the roof is on fire before the rest of the building. And again, another picture shows you the issues of crowd control. You can see the people trying to get things out. You can see that the streams just don't even begin to get high enough to put out the fire. More pictures of people fleeing, pictures of people looting. And again, problems with people determining who are looters and who weren't. Here's a picture of Franklin Street. Franklin Street was a very elegant street. This is a picture of before the fire, and this is a picture of it during the fire. So we can see how devastating it was. The fire, this is not an overly dramatic picture of the fire, illustration of the fire. It apparently really looked like this. The fire could be seen from miles out, 50 miles out at sea, because it was so bright and so hot. And you can see how it's devastating the city. And it was, again, the sense of the fire flame that was moving throughout the whole city, burning right down to the wharfs and burning all these valuable, extremely valuable buildings there. Now, the firefighters put up a very valiant struggle. This is kind of a bit of a fanciful illustration that appeared on the cover of Harper's Magazine. But I think it kind of shows basically what the firefighters were up against. All they had was water to try to put out this fire, and the water was often running out. They didn't have the safety equipment we had today. They had helmets, they had coats, but you can see the sense of determination of these firefighters, and you can see just what they were up against, which was very, very intense. Now, here's one little ironic story I want to share with you. Patrick Donahue was a publisher of the Catholic newspaper of Boston, and he was quite a guy. He was actually quite interesting. He went on to a very, very great career, but he ran the Pilot, and apparently he had asked that the hydrant be removed in front of his building for some reason. We're not really certain why. Maybe he didn't want. But anyway, during the Boston fire, Great Boston Fire, he was there to watch as his new building, burned to the ground. There were other issues. One was the use of gunpowder. I won't go into a lot of detail on this, but there was a huge amount of pressure on Damrell to do something to stop the spread of this fire. So many people advocated blowing up buildings, getting gunpowder, blowing up buildings to create a fire break so that you couldn't, the fire couldn't go any further. And Damrell did allow this to happen until he stopped it, because what was happening is that buildings were just being blown up kind of randomly. The fire was jumping over them. And there's one other infrastructure problem. At this point in time, the city was lit by gas flames. And so a lot of these buildings had little gas burners that provided light, but these gas burners could not be turned off block by block or building by building. It was a main spigot, basically. It's not a spigot, but that cut it off. And so what happened when a building was blown up, the gas would continue to flow out, it ignited, and the fire was spread. So the use of gunpowder in the fire was very controversial. Obviously, creating a fire break is a legitimate way to fight these things, but it didn't really work in this situation. What was helpful was Damrell's early call to bring in help from all over all over New England. Fire engines from Maine, from New Hampshire, from Connecticut, all rushed down to Boston. And what they did, they loaded up their fire engines on trains and they brought them down by train. So this is an illustration of them coming down by train. So I think this is something that Admiral correctly assessed very early on, that this was a huge fire and he needed to get help from all over. And they did come in. And in fact, one of the fire engines, the Kearsarge, which was a fire company from Portsmouth, New Hampshire, came down. They came down fairly late. It was already to Sunday when they came down. But they were instrumental in helping to save the Old South Church, or the Old South Meeting House, we now call it, which is probably one of the most historic buildings in Boston. That is where the Boston Tea Party was planned, numerous meetings there. Fire was breaking out all around this building. In fact, many people thought it was doomed, but the Kearsarge was able to get in position, you can see how far its streams were going up, and was able to save this building. And many people helped on this, but the Kearsarge is often credited for helping to save this building. And it came all the way from Portsmouth, New Hampshire. So General was eventually able to mass enough fire engines on the front, you can kind of see, and hold the fire back. They couldn't do any, obviously it burned out to the wharfs. They couldn't do anything about it, but they were able to control it. They got it under control by Sunday morning, but Sunday night, another fire broke out. They had to take care of that. But eventually, after a huge amount of struggle, they were able to put out the fire. Here's a really neat picture of one of the fire engines chugging away. This is after the fire's out, but you can kind of see it was still generating steam. And so Monday morning, the fire was considered out, and then the building started to rehappen. But let me show you this. This is a picture of Boston before the fire, and this is one after the fire. You can just see how much the city was taken out. Again, it wasn't necessarily as extensive as the Chicago fire. Chicago fire was huge, but this took out some of the most expensive and valuable real estate in the city. Here are some pictures of the ruins, and we'll talk the tally. Basically, 776 buildings, 60 acres. It was well over $1.6 billion. And so it was one of the most expensive fires per acre. And at 1.6, by the way, that's in today's dollars. Here's the thing about this fire, that we don't know the exact number of people killed. And that was not uncommon in fires of that time. The toll varied. I spent a lot of time trying to figure out the toll from various sources, but we don't know exactly how many civilians were killed. It was very low. It was like maybe 20, maybe 30. It was really not that high. Boston was very lucky. And I think that's one of the reasons why it's not as well known today, because it didn't have that really high death toll of the Chicago fire. And we were very lucky. Where there was a high toll was in the fire department. We had about 11 firefighters or former fire volunteers killed in this fire, a very high number. And these people, young and old, we have some ages of some of them, they gave their lives for this. And even that's a little unclear if someone from New Hampshire, from Connecticut also died. But this is a very high toll for the firefighters who died. The news was, of course, went around the country. And this illustration is by the famous Thomas Nast, who is a cartoonist who brought you the donkey and the elephant. He used those as symbols for the Republican and Democratic Party. And here he's trying to represent how devastating this fire was for Boston. You can see this stacked headline, and you can see how important that was for the rest of the country. And here again, we have photos. We have photos of the aftermath of this fire. We have no photos of it during the fire. We have photos of the aftermath. And here are some of them. And some of them were done by some of the best landscape photographers of the day. And they have a kind of eerie beauty. And they're very evocative. And you can see the remains of buildings, the brick buildings fared better than granite buildings. Granite buildings, as I said, tended to explode. Bricks seemed to withstand the fire better than the granite, but it was still very devastating. One thing that was interesting is a lot of these photos were sent all over the world, and they were used in newspapers, not as photographs because there wasn't the technology, but they were turned into illustrations. So you can see, on the one hand, there was a photo of them trying to put out where the fire was still smoldering, and you can see the illustration that someone created for it. Panoramas were created. This panorama has actually been turned into an illustration, but the photographers went crazy. After the fire, they went all out in chronicling this huge disaster, and it's from their work that we kind of know about the huge devastation of this fire. So their work is very important to understanding how this fire spread and just how hot it was. You can get a sense for that. But there's one other thing, and that was a commercial opportunity. At this time, people were very into stereographic cards or stereographic systems in which they could use these cards to get a 3D image. And this was very, very popular in those days. And here's a picture of the one of these 3D cards. And basically you put it in your slider. I think if you had kids, you had something like this, but you get a 3D effect. And this is extremely popular. In fact, there's hundreds of these things were produced all over the place. And when I first found this out and I was looking at this, and I was thinking to myself, why do a lot of people want to see all these pictures of destruction? I mean, gosh, it's very ghoulish, you know, people in their parlors looking at these horrible pictures. And then I thought, oh, wait a minute, what do I see at the movies? I see things being blown up. In fact, these are the disaster movies of their day. So everything you see in a Marvel movie is with all those things blowing up. This is why people were very interested in these scenes of destruction from a safe distance. So these were very popular. There were also artifacts left from this fire, and I keep running across this. This is at a fire museum. We found that people will be selling that. Here's something very poignant. Here's supposedly some letters from 1870. They're left after the fire that were not quite all the way burned. There was also what we would call disaster tourism. People flocked to what they started to call the burn district in Boston. Because people are fascinated with the aftermath. So a lot of people were going there to see what was going on. Business owners rushed in to see if there was anything they could salvage. And for a number of them had safes that were in the middle of the fire. Many of them did not survive, but many of them were opened, and they were able to find their books and sometimes money and things like that. And many of them started to set up almost immediately set up shop, even on the ruins of their places. For example, several people rushed. A lot of them couldn't even tell where their businesses were, but if they could, they put up signs telling people where to go and where they were moved to. So there was effort to try to recover from this fire as quickly as possible. And here's something fun. This is a newspaper account, or a sort of a pamphlet that came out very soon after the fire. It was really literally rushed out after the fire. And you notice they have an ad for safes. And so with testimony from people saying that your safe protected all my goods and services in the Great Boston Fire. So for many people, this was a commercial opportunity to prove how good their product was. And I thought that was kind of amusing. But Boston rebuilt fairly quickly. By a sheer luck, many of the businesses were covered by insurance. The Lloyds of London, many of them were getting ready to pull their insurance because they knew about the problems in the infrastructure in Boston, but they hadn't done it yet. So many businesses, not all, but many businesses were put out, but many of them had insurance and were able to start rebuilding. And many of them started doing that almost immediately. And in a few years, Boston was rebuilt. And a lot of improvements that could have been done to the city streets in Boston were not, but they were able to rebuild. Now, that didn't mean they put the fire behind them. The Boston, being Boston, created a commission to study the causes of the fire and to say what happened and what could we do better and blah, blah, blah. And it went on for months and months, and they had hundreds of witnesses called. John Damerel was called 3 times. Other people were called before the commission, and so they thoroughly investigated. And guess who was really blamed for the fire? If you thought John Damerel, you were right. John Damerel, although he had warned repeatedly about the fire, was blamed for not deploying his men correctly during the fire. They said that he was too much on the front lines. He didn't act like a general, that he, allowed for this gunpowder. And it was just kind of ironic that he got blamed for so much of this fire, even though he tried so hard to warn about it. But here's the thing about John Damerel. He could have slunk off and licked his wounds, but he didn't. And I'll explain that in a minute. So the result of this fire was that there were eventually codes put in, codes were enforced, new buildings had to have fire breaks between the buildings, but it took a while. Ironically enough, it took a number of fires before the city got really serious about enforcing and putting in more stringent codes. They did get better water into the system, but it took them a few years, but they did get it. The city also reorganized the fire department, because again, they're blaming the fire department. Damerel, who was reelected as fire chief right after the fire, when they reorganized the fire department, he quit. He just said, I'm out of here. So eventually, there were a number of insights that came out of this fire. But the main thing that really affected the country was John Damerel again. Again, he could have just slunk away, but instead, after he resigns, he forms what will be later known as the International Association of Fire Chiefs, which is still going on today. And the Association of Fire Chiefs began to look at how they could deal with the scourge of urban fires around the country. And Damerel was very much into the idea of preventing fires, stopping before they started. So in 1877, he became the chief of the city Department of Building Inspection, Boston, and he remained in that position for the next 25 years. He was very much involved with international movements to make buildings all around the world and the country and the world safer. And he worked very hard to establish the National Model Building Code. He had died before it was actually published, but he was very much involved with it. So the impact of the fire resided not just in the fire, but the action of this of a man who, having warned about it, it happened anyway, but he did not let that stop him. He continued to fight for fire safety for the next, for as long as he could, and he set up systems and mechanisms that made the country safer. There is actually a wonderful documentary called Damerel's Fire, which is about Damerel and his struggles to make the country safer. And a lot of people believe that he was responsible for helping to stop the urban fires that were all over the country then. Here's another wonderful little story that I thought I'd share with you. I think I told you about the Kearsarge, which was this fire engine or fire company. It was a fire engine that came down from Portsmouth, New Hampshire to fight the fire. Well, the Kearsarge, the steam engine itself, was preserved. It languished for a long time in someone's shed. I saw it when it was in that condition. It was really kind of falling apart, but they did preserve it. But then somebody bought it and had it restored. A collector had it restored. And in 2010, the Boston Fire Historical Society, of which I'm a member, brought the Kearsarge to Boston on the anniversary of the Great Fire to put it in the exact position where it was when we think it helped with the Old South. So we kind of we don't know for sure, but it's a marvelous piece of technology. If you're into steampunk, people were stopping by, looking at it. It was a wonderful experience, and it really helped to show people the technology and how technology has grown in terms of fire and firefighting. Today, very few traces of this fire. There are a few plaques up around, but for the most part, people walking through downtown aren't aware that they're literally walking on ash. They're walking on an area that was totally devastated in 1872. Now, it's interesting, Box 52, it's actually not Box 52, it's called that, but it's labeled Box 52 because Boston wants to honor that particular incident in history. So this is Box 52 today, and you can see it's got a kind of a special light on the top of it. And a fire buff organization that is still going on today in Boston is called the Box 52 Association. And every year they have a dinner and they remember the fire of 1872 and the lessons learned, and think about Damrell and what he experienced. But the Box 52, you can go visit today. Of course, there's a Starbucks near it because there's a Starbucks everywhere. And what is also nice is the Old South Meeting House. It still stands. It's still there. It's still attracting tourists, and it really is a remarkable monument to Boston history and really American history. So that is still going on there. Now, another nice thing that happened. In 2011, the Boston Fire Department, I think I got a little typo there, bought a new fireboat, and Marine One, but they called it the John S. Damrell, named it after him. And it's quite a remarkable machine. Sometimes you'll see it going out. They'll do, obviously it's used to fight fires on the wharf, but it's also a very vital part of the firefighting apparatus of the city. And John Damrell it's been named for John Damrell, because here's the thing about this fire is that even if the general public doesn't know too much about it, the Boston Fire Department knows a lot about it and has studied it. And for years afterwards, many firefighters were worried about it happening again. And I don't think they may not be now, but they do know if you don't have the proper infrastructure, if you don't have the water, if you don't have immediately a fire response, you can be in big trouble. So it's kind of a legacy within the fire department. A lot of people may not know about it, but it is 150 years later and people are starting to learn about it. Now, here's the thing, and I'll kind of start ending on this note, is that the fire fiend is not gone. We still have a fire fiend, but it's shifted from the urban fires to the wildland fires. In other words, forest fires, or that space between cities and a wilderness. And now we're seeing these huge mammoth fires in California and Arizona and the West, Australia, different places for various reasons. And that is the new fire fiend. That's where places like the NFPA and other people are trying to put their efforts. What can we do about it? How can we protect people in these particular areas? And so the actual dangerous function, but not the fact that there are multiple causes for these particular fires, just as there were for the Great Boston Fire. So I think we can look at the fact that constant vigilance is still needed today, even with our firefighting equipment and sprinkler systems and new ways of alarm system. It is still a problem. So I'd like to draw your attention to some resources. The Boston Fire Historical Society, if you're interested in learning more about this fire, has a lot of material on this fire. There's the documentary I mentioned, and there are also photos. Many of the photos I'm using of the fire are on the Boston Public Library site. You can see them. They're amazing. Every time I look at them, they chill me because they're just so dramatic in terms of seeing the city, my city, in this devastated state for reasons that in some cases could have been prevented. So I'd like to pause here. I want to thank everybody for your attention. I'm going to stop the share, and we'll open it up to questions, and really appreciate your attention.